Long before the pyramids, before Greece, before Rome, there was a land known as Sumer, the cradle of civilization, where humanity took its first steps into writing, astronomy, mathematics, and kingship. But hidden within the clay tablets of this ancient world lies a story far stranger than history dares to tell, a story of gods who may not have been gods at all, but visitors from beyond the stars. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, powerful beings who descended from the heavens and shaped the destiny of mankind. Were they symbols of natural forces, or something much more tangible? Why do their myths speak of knowledge, technology, and wars in the skies? Could these stories be fragments of a forgotten truth, that humanity was never alone? Tonight we'll walk through the ziggurats, decipher the cuneiform tablets, and uncover the mysteries buried beneath thousands of years of dust. A journey where myth and mystery blur, and where the line between gods and cosmic travelers may vanish. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. I want to know who is joining this exploration across the world. Now, take a deep breath, because the story of the Anunnaki begins. In the dawn of time, long before the pages of history were written, there was a land that flourished between two great rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates carved a fertile cradle of life, a land where the desert gave way to fields of abundance. It was here in Mesopotamia that the first sparks of civilization ignited, and at its heart lay Sumer, a world so ancient and so mysterious that its very origins seem cloaked in shadow. Imagine standing in those early days when humanity was still learning to tame the wild earth. Nomadic tribes wandered across vast plains, hunting, gathering, struggling to survive against the merciless sun and unpredictable storms. Yet suddenly, almost without warning, there rose cities, real cities with walls of mud brick, temples that kissed the skies, and streets that pulsed with organized life. In Sumer, civilization seemed to appear not through slow trial and error, but as if it had been handed down fully formed. The land itself was unforgiving, but the ingenuity of its people transformed it into a paradise. Canals and irrigation systems spread like veins through the soil, feeding crops of barley and wheat. Herds of cattle and flocks of sheep moved under the watchful eyes of shepherds. Fishermen cast nets in the rivers, while merchants bartered goods in markets that buzzed with voices from every corner of the land. All of this, in a world still young, seems impossibly advanced. But perhaps the most striking image of Sumer was not its fields or its markets, but its towering ziggurats. These massive structures rose like stairways to the heavens, tier upon tier of stone and brick, crowned with temples dedicated to the gods. From miles away, their silhouettes dominated the horizon, monuments not only to faith but to knowledge, power, and something more elusive, connection with the sky. Priests ascended their steps to commune with the divine, and in the flickering glow of sacred fires, whispers of mysteries older than mankind itself were passed down. It was within these temples that writing was born. The Sumerians pressed wedges into clay tablets, creating cuneiform, the world's first written script. With it they recorded laws, transactions, hymns, and stories. They charted the movements of stars, measured time, and calculated land divisions with mathematical precision. How is it that such sophisticated systems emerged in one of the earliest societies on Earth? The leap is so great, the transformation so sudden, that it feels less like an evolution and more like an intervention. Among the countless tablets recovered from ruins, there are accounts not just of trade or harvests, but of beings who came from beyond. The Sumerians spoke of gods who descended from the heavens, beings who did not merely inspire, but actively instructed. These figures, the Anunnaki, were described as majestic, powerful, and strangely human in form, yet possessing knowledge far beyond human grasp. It was said they gave laws to kings, taught agriculture to farmers, astronomy to priests, and the very foundations of civilization itself. When we study Sumer, we often admire their brilliance, their mathematics, their architecture, their poetry. But the Sumerians themselves did not claim that these wonders were their own invention. Instead, they pointed upwards, to the heavens, and credited their knowledge to those who came down. Was this simply mythology, the poetic imagination of an ancient people? Or was it a carefully encoded memory, passed down through story, of encounters with beings whose origins lay far beyond the earth? Consider this. Humanity elsewhere at the time lived in scattered tribes, hunting with stone tools, surviving by instinct. Yet here in Sumer, we find kingship, law codes, literature, and cities that would rival many that came thousands of years later. What force accelerated them so drastically? And why does their mythology speak not of gradual discovery, but of gifts given by divine hands? The priests of Sumer acted as mediators between humans and the divine. In their rituals, offerings of grain, wine, and incense were laid before statues that represented the gods. But these statues were not abstract symbols. They were described as houses for the divine presence, vessels that could hold the essence of beings who might walk among men. To the Sumerians, the gods were not distant or hidden. They were active participants in the world, shaping its destiny. And yet, the tales that surround them are filled with peculiar details. Gods who quarrel among themselves, like rulers of kingdoms. Gods who descend to earth in fiery chariots. Gods who demand the construction of great temples, not unlike command centers, where they might reside and oversee their domains. The myths read not as dreams, but as histories written in the language of awe. They are vivid, precise, and strange in their consistency. As the Sumerian cities grew, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, they became centers of culture that drew the gaze of the ancient world. Each city was said to belong to a god, each ziggurat a ladder stretching between heaven and earth. The rulers of these cities were not merely kings, they were chosen by the gods, appointed to govern in their name. Power was divine, authority was cosmic, and every law traced back to those who descended from above. The strangeness deepens when we examine their understanding of the cosmos. The Sumerians knew of planets invisible to the naked eye, charted celestial cycles with uncanny precision, and built calendars that aligned with solstices and equinoxes. How did a civilization so young possess astronomical knowledge that should have taken millennia to refine? They themselves gave the answer. It was taught to them. This knowledge was not scattered or fragmented. It was systematic, unified, and purposeful. Like a curriculum designed by teachers who came with an agenda, the Anunnaki were those teachers, and in the stories preserved on tablets, their presence is both awe-inspiring and unsettling. They are described not only as givers of wisdom, but as beings with their own rivalries, ambitions, and desires. They are not abstract deities beyond human comprehension. They are characters with motives, as though they were rulers of flesh and blood. The clay tablets tell us that when the gods descended, the world was reshaped. Humanity shifted from scattered tribes into organized cities, from survival to progress. And in their myths, there is always the echo of an origin, not entirely our own. Did the Anunnaki simply represent natural forces, dressed in human-like form for the sake of storytelling? Or were they something else entirely, beings whose presence on Earth left fingerprints we still struggle to interpret? The truth of Sumer is not found only in ruins or artifacts, but in the questions that linger. Why here? Why then? Why such sudden brilliance in a world otherwise shrouded in prehistory? What secrets lie within the stories of gods who walked among men, shared their wisdom, and then, for reasons unknown, departed? The ancient cities may now lie in dust, their ziggurats reduced to crumbling mounds, their temples silent. Yet their voice survives, pressed into clay, whispering across 5,000 years. And that voice tells of a time when the heavens opened and knowledge descended, a time when humanity's destiny changed forever. And so we stand at the edge of mystery, gazing back into the shadows of Sumer, where the first chapters of civilization were written, not by human hands alone, but perhaps with guidance from the stars. In the heart of Sumerian belief, the world was not ruled by chance, nor left to the blind forces of nature. Instead, it was governed by a vast assembly of divine beings, each with their own character, their own domain, and their own role in shaping the destiny of humanity. This pantheon, though ancient, feels strangely familiar. Unlike distant gods who exist in abstraction, the Sumerian deities were vivid, complex, and deeply human in their flaws and ambitions. They loved and hated, plotted and forgave, raised cities and destroyed them. They were not mere spirits drifting in the ether. They were present, active, and embodied. At the head of this pantheon stood An, sometimes called Anu, the great father of the heavens. He was the figure of ultimate authority, distant yet decisive, a god whose throne was said to rest in the skies themselves. From him stemmed the legitimacy of all rulers, both divine and human. Kings claimed their power as a gift from An, and his very name evoked the unreachable heights of the firmament. Yet in the myths, he is not omnipotent in the way later religions would imagine. He does not watch all silently and forever. Instead, he is a ruler among rulers, one voice in a council of powerful beings, a patriarch who sometimes withdraws, leaving the governance of earth to his children. If An was the father, his son, Enlil was the enforcer of order. Lord of the air, master of storms, Enlil embodied both life-giving winds and destructive tempests. He was fierce, decisive, a god who could crown kings and topple them just as swiftly. To the Sumerians, Enlil was a figure both revered and feared, for his judgments were absolute and his temper formidable. He was the protector of cosmic balance, yet also the one who, in fits of wrath, sought to wipe humanity from existence. It is in Enlil's contradictions that we begin to sense something deeper, a being not of boundless divinity, but of personality, motive and desire, qualities we associate with leaders, generals, and rulers of flesh and blood. Then came Enki, Enlil's half-brother, lord of the fresh waters and the keeper of wisdom. Where Enlil's voice was thunder, Enki's was the whisper of flowing rivers, calm yet insistent. He was the trickster, the problem solver, the one who delighted in cleverness. In myth, Enki often acted as humanity's advocate, offering guidance and protection when Enlil's fury threatened annihilation. He gifted knowledge of irrigation, farming, crafts, and the hidden arts of magic. His domain, the subterranean waters, the Abzu, was seen as the reservoir of life itself. If Enlil represented control, Enki represented creativity, adaptability, and progress. And once again in his stories, we find a god not removed from mankind but intimately involved, teaching, guiding, even interfering. But the Sumerian pantheon extended far beyond this triad. There was Inanna, goddess of love, war, and political power. Fierce and ambitious, she strode across the myths as both seductress and warrior, embodying contradictions that made her one of the most compelling figures of the ancient world. She sought dominion, challenged rivals, and in her descent into the underworld, revealed mysteries of death and rebirth. To the people of Uruk, she was not merely a symbol of fertility or violence. She was a patron, a presence that shaped their city's fate. There was Ninhursag, the Great Mother, linked to the earth and fertility. She was the womb of creation, the one from whose essence life was drawn. In the stories of humanity's origins, it was she who molded the first humans, shaping them from clay before the gods breathed into them the spark of life. Her role, maternal yet deeply involved, again suggests not an abstract goddess of soil, but a figure whose hands worked, whose choices mattered, whose actions left permanent marks on mankind. Other figures filled this cosmic assembly. Utu, the sun god who brought justice and shone light upon lies. Nanna, the moon god, guardian of cycles and tides. Nergal, lord of plague and death, whose presence inspired dread. Each god had a domain, each controlled a sphere of influence, and yet their interactions read less like the detached workings of cosmic energies and more like the drama of rival courts, kingdoms and dynasties. And here lies the strangeness. For if these beings were only metaphors, why do they appear with such clarity, such personality, such human-like rivalries? Why do the stories linger on their quarrels, their alliances, their wars? The pantheon of Sumer feels less like mythology and more like history told in symbolic language perhaps, but rooted in encounters that were tangible, visible, unforgettable. The texts describe meetings between gods and men not as visions or dreams, but as physical encounters. Kings were summoned into temples where the gods appeared in dazzling forms. Gifts were exchanged, commands were given, punishments dealt. When the gods traveled, they did so in vehicles described as chariots of the heavens, fiery machines that blazed across the sky. When they fought, their weapons unleashed devastation that scorched the earth and darkened the skies. To us, these accounts read like fantasy, but to the Sumerians they were reality, recorded with the same seriousness as laws and treaties. Could it be that the Sumerian gods were not immaterial beings of worship, but entities who walked among men, whose advanced technology was mistaken for divine power? Their knowledge of astronomy, their command of agriculture, their gift of writing, all these could be seen not as miraculous inventions, but as teachings, instructions passed down from those who already possessed such understanding. The gods in this view were not creators in the abstract sense, but mentors, rulers, and perhaps overseers. Consider the hierarchy of the pantheon itself, and at the top, delegating authority, Enlil and Enki beneath him, each with domains and responsibilities, then a host of subordinate deities, each tied to a city, each ruling as though they were governors or officials under a higher order. The structure mirrors not chaos, but administration, an organized system of command. It is eerily reminiscent of an empire, where power flows downward from a central authority. Was the pantheon simply the projection of human political systems onto the divine, or was it the other way around, human systems modeled after the governance of these beings? Even the relationships between gods reveal hints of something more. Their rivalries over resources, their disputes over humanity, their marriages and offspring, all suggest bloodlines, dynasties, and succession struggles. The divine council was not an abstract assembly of cosmic forces. It was a family of powerful figures, driven by desires and ambitions that echo those of kings and conquerors. They loved, they betrayed, they sought revenge, and they forged alliances. If these are metaphors, they are strikingly detailed ones. If they are memories, they tell of a reality where the gods were flesh and blood beings with very human motives. And yet, in their powers, they surpassed humanity. They could shape life, command the skies, unleash floods, and illuminate the mysteries of the cosmos. They were not omnipotent, but they were formidable, advanced in ways that would seem impossible to ancient eyes. To a shepherd in Sumer, the sight of a machine descending from the skies might well be described as a god arriving in fire. To a farmer taught the secrets of planting by an otherworldly figure, the gift would seem divine. So we are left with a choice. Do we read the Sumerian pantheon as myth, imaginative tales meant to explain the world, or do we take them at their word as accounts of beings who walked among men, guided them, ruled them, and left behind stories of their presence? The answer is elusive, hidden in the cracks of clay tablets, buried beneath millennia of dust. But what is undeniable is that the pantheon of Sumer was not a gallery of distant deities. It was a living council, a hierarchy of figures whose influence was felt in every field, every harvest, every law and every war. They were gods, yes, but perhaps not gods as we usually imagine them. Perhaps they were something else, something stranger, something that once stood on the very soil of Mesopotamia. And as we listen to the voices of these myths, we feel the edges of another possibility pressing closer, that the Anunnaki were not dreams, but visitors, that they were not phantoms of belief, but presences of reality, and that, in their stories, preserved against time, we may be reading the echoes of the first encounters between humanity and those who came from the stars. In the great expanse of the Sumerian cosmos, two figures towered above the rest, shaping the fate not only of the gods, but of humanity itself. At the summit of the divine hierarchy stood Anu, the father of the heavens, the sovereign whose domain was the boundless sky. Beneath him, though still far above mortal reach, reigned Enlil, lord of the winds, master of breath and storm, the wielder of authority over the earth. To the Sumerians, these two were not simply symbols of the natural world. They were rulers, commanders, beings whose presence mirrored the order of kingdoms and empires. And in their myths, we glimpse something far more complex than devotion. We see the reflection of governance, power, and control, as though the divine realm was less a place of worship than a court of kings. Anu, whose very name meant heaven, was the distant patriarch, the ultimate source of kingship. His throne was imagined high above the world, beyond human sight, yet his authority permeated every corner of creation. When kings of Sumer rose to power, they did so only by claiming Anu's blessing, the Mi, or divine decrees, which he bestowed upon those deemed worthy. Without his sanction, no ruler was legitimate. To understand Anu is to understand the foundation of Sumerian society, a belief that all order stemmed from above, from a figure who governed not as a god, of abstract forces, but as a sovereign enthroned in the skies. Yet Anu was not omnipresent, nor constantly involved in earthly affairs. His presence in myths is often brief, decisive, almost ceremonial. He appears when legitimacy must be conferred, when judgment must be rendered, When the balance of power requires the intervention of the supreme authority, then he withdraws, leaving his sons and subordinates to enforce his will. In this distance, in this pattern of delegation, we sense not the mystery of the unknowable divine, but the structure of a ruler who commands from afar, maintaining order through governors, lieutenants, and emissaries. Was Anu not so much a god as a king whose palace simply rested in the heavens rather than on earth? If Anu was the source, Enlil was the executor, lord of air, master of wind. Enlil was the figure who made Anu's authority tangible. His name echoed through the temples of Nippur, where his great sanctuary, the Ekur, stood, as the earthly seat of divine power. It was here in this mountain house that the decrees of destiny were pronounced, binding not only humanity, but the very gods themselves. To approach Enlil was to stand before the enforcer of cosmic law, a figure who could bless with abundance or destroy with fury. Enlil's presence in the myths is far more vivid than Anu's. He is active, decisive, quick to anger, and relentless in the defense of order. He separates heaven from earth, establishes boundaries, and ensures that each being knows its place. Yet he is also feared, for his judgments are often harsh. It was Enlil who decreed the Great Flood to erase humanity, declaring that mankind had become too noisy, too troublesome, too disruptive to the balance of the world. His was the voice of command, the voice that did not waver, the voice that could both raise and annihilate civilizations. But if we look closely at Enlil's role, another image begins to emerge. His governance resembles that of a general, a commander charged with maintaining discipline in a territory far from the supreme throne. He enforces rules, punishes rebellion, and secures the order established by Anu. His wrath, though terrifying, is not the chaos of a storm god, but the calculated severity of a ruler determined to uphold authority. The flood, in this view, was less an act of divine whimsy, and more the strategy of a leader seeking to erase a failed experiment, to reset the order he had been tasked to preserve. The myths tell us that Enlil did not act alone. He presided over councils of gods, issuing commands, consulting allies, and quarreling with rivals. His governance was political, his authority contested, his decisions debated. What kind of gods operate in councils, convene assemblies, and enforce decrees? What kind of divine realm requires the machinery of politics and the hierarchy of power? The pantheon begins to look less like the mystical workings of nature and more like the organized structure of an empire not of men but of beings whose origins may have stretched far beyond the stars. Imagine for a moment what the Sumerians might have witnessed. Powerful figures descending from the heavens, wielding devices that crackled with energy, speaking with voices amplified by technology, commanding storms and winds through means beyond comprehension. To the shepherds and farmers of Sumer, such beings could only be gods. Yet, their behavior, rivalries, councils, decrees, suggest something far more familiar. These were rulers, administrators, perhaps even colonizers, establishing dominion over a young humanity. Their power was immense, but it was not infinite. Their wisdom was vast, but it was not without conflict. They were not ethereal abstractions. They were presences, embodied and commanding, who demanded allegiance and obedience. Consider the way authority flowed between Anu and Enlil. Anu, distant in the heavens, delegated power downward. Enlil, stationed on earth, enacted that power with severity. Beneath them, other gods, Enki, Inanna, Utu, fulfilled specialized roles, much like officials in a vast administration. Cities were assigned to gods as though territories to governors. Each temple was not merely a house of worship, but a seat of authority, a place where the human and divine realms intersected under the supervision of those who ruled. This is not the randomness of myth. This is the order of governance. And yet in their stories we find a haunting duality. For while Anu and Enlil commanded obedience, their motives often clashed. Enlil sought to restrain humanity, to limit its growth, to preserve the balance he was charged to maintain. Anu's will was distant, enigmatic, sometimes aligned with his son, sometimes not. In these tensions, humanity became the pawn, caught between powers whose disagreements could alter the fate of the world. To the Sumerians, this was divine drama. To us, it may suggest something more: conflict among rulers of flesh and blood, whose interests were not always aligned, whose commands revealed not divine perfection, but the messy politics of power. The myths do not hide their human qualities. Enlil falls to anger, punishes swiftly, and shows favoritism. Anu delegates, withdraws, and judges from afar. They are powerful, but they are not flawless. They are wise, but they are not beyond dispute. These qualities make them vivid, relatable, and suspiciously similar to kings, emperors, and conquerors throughout history. If these were truly gods, why such flaws? Why such politics? Unless they were never gods in the first place, but something else entirely. Beings whose superiority of knowledge and technology cloaked them in the mantle of divinity when seen through human eyes. The Sumerians described their gods as radiant, shining, clothed in brilliance. Their voices thundered, their commands shook the earth. Was this the language of worship, or the attempt of ancient scribes to describe advanced beings, wielding tools and devices so alien they could only be described as supernatural? The ziggurats that rose in Sumer's cities, stairways to the heavens, were they temples for worship, or platforms designed to connect with those who descended from the skies? Anu and Enlil stand as symbols of power, order, and governance. But when we strip away the poetic veil, we are left with the impression of kings from another world, rulers who divided authority, enforced laws, and shaped the destiny of humanity. Their thrones may have rested in the heavens, their voices may have commanded storms, but their actions, governance, administration, politics, speak not of gods beyond comprehension, but of beings whose authority was as real and structured as any earthly empire. And so the mystery deepens. Were Anu and Enlil truly divine, or were they kings from the stars, wielding technology mistaken for thunder, knowledge mistaken for wisdom, and authority mistaken for the will of heaven? The tablets do not answer directly. They whisper in fragments, in stories wrapped in myth, in symbols that blur the line between faith and memory. Yet through those whispers, we catch glimpses of a past where the rulers of the skies may have walked upon the earth, not as distant gods, but as sovereigns whose empire stretched from heaven to Sumer, and perhaps far beyond. Among the gods of Sumer, none shines with greater intrigue than Enki, the lord of the Abzu, the god of fresh waters, wisdom, and hidden knowledge. Where Anu's authority was distant and Enlil's commands often harsh, Enki emerged as a figure of cunning, compassion, and subtle rebellion. He was the problem solver of the pantheon, the one who understood both the cosmic order and the fragile condition of humankind. In the tablets of clay that speak across millennia, his name is etched not as a destroyer, but as a benefactor. And yet, even in his generosity, there lies contradiction, for Enki was not only a savior, but also a trickster, a god whose loyalty to mankind sometimes clashed with the will of his own kin. Enki's domain was the Abzu, the subterranean reservoir of fresh waters hidden beneath the earth, a mysterious place both physical and symbolic. To the Sumerians, water was life, and in Enki's hands lay the secret of abundance. He was the one who brought fertility to the land, who taught irrigation, who revealed the mysteries of agriculture. Through him, barren soil was made fruitful, and the people of Sumer thrived. But beyond his role as provider, Enki was also the keeper of wisdom, the one who possessed the Mi, the divine decrees that governed civilization. These decrees were not vague blessings, they were tangible powers, the arts of writing, the skills of craftsmanship, the laws of society, the secrets of magic. In myth, Enki distributed these gifts, sometimes by command, sometimes by clever trickery, ensuring that humanity was not left in ignorance. It is here that Enki's contradictions emerge most sharply. On one hand, he was a god, part of the ruling assembly, bound by the decrees of Anu and the severity of Enlil. On the other, he acted with a freedom that defied those very decrees, siding with humanity when the rest of the pantheon sought to punish it. The flood myth tells us this most clearly. When Enlil decreed that mankind should be erased in a deluge, it was Enki who whispered warnings, who found ways to preserve life, who guided Atrahasis, the Sumerian Noah, to build a vessel that would ride the waters and save the seed of humanity. Was this rebellion an act of compassion, or was it something more, a deliberate choice to preserve the species he himself had shaped? For Enki is also bound to the creation of mankind. In the myths, it is he, alongside Ninhursag, who molded humans from clay, mixing earth with the blood of a slain god to give life. The story is poetic, But beneath its symbolism lies a provocative question. Was this the memory of something more literal? Was humanity truly created in a divine workshop, fashioned and altered by beings who possessed knowledge far beyond our comprehension? If Enki was the architect of this design, then his role as protector is less mysterious, for who would create only to destroy? His loyalty to humanity may not have been rebellion at all, but responsibility. And yet in his stories, we see not only wisdom but mischief. Enki is often portrayed as cunning, sometimes intoxicated, sometimes manipulating others to achieve his ends. He is not flawless, not purely benevolent. He acts with motives that shift between kindness and self-interest. This paradox makes him more human and perhaps more believable. He is not the distant perfection of a deity beyond time, but the vivid presence of a being with personality, flaws, and choices. If he truly walked among men, perhaps his contradictions were simply the contradictions of any ruler, any mentor, any being of flesh and blood. The Sumerians sang hymns to Enki, praising his wisdom and his waters, his ability to unravel knots, to solve riddles, to bring clarity where confusion reigned. They described him as radiant, as one who shone with a brilliance unlike that of mortals. They told of his descent from the heavens, his presence in temples where priests received visions and commands. They credited him with teaching the crafts of building, the designs of cities, the systems of law. Again and again, we see the pattern. Humanity advances suddenly, dramatically, as though knowledge had been given, not discovered. And always Enki stands at the center of this transformation. But why? Why would a god, or a being mistaken for a god, care so deeply about human progress? Why would Enki risk the wrath of his brother Enlil to preserve mankind? Why would he distribute the me to ensure civilization thrived? Was this compassion born of genuine attachment, or was it a calculated choice, the protection of a species created for a purpose? If the Anunnaki truly walked among men, then humanity may not have been an accident of nature, but the outcome of deliberate design. And in that case, Enki's loyalty may not be kindness, but duty, the responsibility of a creator to his creation. The contradictions sharpen when we compare Enki with Enlil. Where Enlil sought control, Enki offered freedom. Where Enlil decreed destruction, Enki whispered survival. Their opposition defines the Sumerian myths, painting humanity's story as one caught between two powers, one that wished to restrain and punish and one that wished to elevate and protect. To the Sumerians, this was divine drama. To us, it reads almost like the tension between commanders of a mission, disagreeing on how to manage their subjects. If Enki's stance seems more sympathetic, perhaps it is because he saw humanity not as a nuisance, but as an investment, one that carried potential worth nurturing. Enki's legacy is not only in myths of survival, but in the foundation of culture itself. In Eridu, one of the oldest cities of Sumer, his temple stood as a beacon of learning, a place where wisdom flowed like water. Priests of Enki were scholars, scribes, teachers, guardians of knowledge. Through them, the influence of Enki extended into every aspect of Sumerian life, from the design of canals to the writing of laws. His presence was not confined to the heavens or the Abzu. It was etched into the daily rhythm of civilization. And still, we must ask, if these stories are echoes of truth, then who was Enki? Was he a god in the sense of human imagination, a spirit woven from myth? Or was he a being of another order entirely, a visitor from beyond, whose advanced knowledge appeared miraculous to those who received it? The Sumerians described him as radiant, as powerful, as different, but also as near, approachable, engaged. He was not an abstraction. He was there, guiding, teaching, shaping. The duality of Enki, benefactor and trickster, creator and deceiver, savior and manipulator, makes him one of the most enigmatic figures of the ancient world. In him, we find the heart of the Sumerian mystery. Gods who were not only worshipped, but who acted, who interfered, who changed the course of human history. And if Enki was indeed a teacher from another world, then his contradictions make even more sense, for he was not perfection, he was power in flesh, a being whose choices could uplift or endanger, whose gifts could enlighten or enslave. As we read the tablets, as we trace the myths, Enki emerges not as a symbol of water alone, but as the symbol of something deeper, the possibility that humanity's progress was not entirely its own, that the leap from primitive survival to civilization was not gradual but sudden, guided, shaped by hands that reached down from the heavens, hands that molded clay, whispered wisdom, and ensured survival when all seemed lost. Enki's story is a story of contradiction, of care and cunning, of rebellion and loyalty. But beneath it lies a haunting question. If the gods of Sumer were not gods at all, why did they care so deeply about us? Was humanity their creation, their responsibility, or something far more enigmatic? A project whose purpose we have yet to understand. The answers remain buried in the ruins, in the fragments of cuneiform, in the myths that echo across time. Yet in those whispers, we hear the voice of Enki, the wise, the cunning, the compassionate, a voice that suggests our story may have never been ours alone. In the ruins of Mesopotamia, buried among fragments of clay tablets, there lies a story unlike any other. It is the story of humanity's beginning, not as an accident of nature, but as an intentional act, a deliberate creation shaped by hands not entirely our own. The Sumerians believed that mankind was molded from clay, fashioned in the likeness of the gods, and given life through their intervention. At first glance, it may seem like myth, a poetic tale meant to explain our existence. But when we listen carefully, when we strip away the symbolism, we begin to hear something far more unsettling. The story may not be myth at all, but memory, a record of a time when humanity was engineered. The myth begins with the gods themselves. According to the tablets, the Anunnaki toiled upon the earth, working the fields, digging canals, performing the labor that sustained their presence in this world. But the gods grew weary. The work was beneath them, and their complaints rose like thunder to the heavens. They demanded relief, demanded a new solution. It was then that the Council of the Gods decided upon a plan. Instead of laboring themselves, they would fashion a new being, one capable of toil, one obedient, one who could serve the needs of the divine. Humanity was not born out of love or chance, but out of necessity, the answer to a problem faced by powerful beings who desired freedom from burden. In the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis epic, the story unfolds with startling clarity. The gods took clay from the earth, the substance of the land itself, and mixed it with the blood of a slain divine being. From this fusion, the first humans were formed. They were shaped, molded, given form by the hands of the gods. And then, through a mysterious act, they were given life, the breath of the divine, the spark that turned clay into flesh. To the Sumerians, this was the origin of mankind. Not evolution, not randomness, but deliberate creation. But what does it mean to be molded from clay? To ancient scribes, clay was the substance of all life, the soil from which food grew, the material from which bricks were made. It was malleable, transformable, capable of becoming anything. In modern eyes, the metaphor takes on a chilling resonance. Clay is not only earth, it can be read as raw material, genetic material, something pliable and ready to be shaped. Could clay be the ancient description of the basic building blocks of life? Could the act of mixing clay with divine essence be the memory of genetic manipulation, where human biology was altered, fused with something beyond? Enki and Ninhursag stand at the heart of this story. It was they who undertook the task of shaping mankind. Enki, the wise god of wisdom, and Ninhursag, the mother goddess, combined their powers to mold humanity. The texts speak of birth goddesses, of a womb, of trials and errors in the process of creation. Some humans were malformed, others incomplete, until finally a design was perfected. These details do not sound like poetry alone. They sound like experimentation, AI, process of trial, correction, and eventual success. It is as though the Sumerians preserved in myth the memory of a laboratory where life itself was crafted and refined. The phrase, breath of life, appears again and again in ancient stories, not only in Sumer but in later traditions that echo it. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Hebrew Genesis, we see the same idea, humanity formed from dust or clay, given life by the breath or spirit of the divine. Was this breath simply symbolic, or was it the attempt of ancient eyes to describe something far more tangible? Could it have been the infusion of energy, of knowledge, of information, what we might now call DNA? If humanity was engineered, the question becomes inevitable. For what purpose? The myths offer one answer plainly: labor. The first humans were created to serve, to toil in the fields and temples, to provide food and offerings for the gods. They were workers, assistants, the hands of a civilization that was not entirely their own. But as time passed, the story grew more complex. Humanity was not only labor, but also subject, student, and participant in a greater plan. The gifts of agriculture, writing, and kingship suggest a dual purpose. Humanity was to serve, yes, but also to thrive, to build, to carry forward the designs of those who shaped them. This duality lies at the heart of the mystery. If the Anunnaki created mankind as servants, why grant them knowledge so vast? Why allow them to advance? Why teach them the arts of civilization? Why not leave them as simple workers bound to ignorance? Unless the gods themselves were divided, some wishing to control, others to elevate. Enlil saw humanity as noisy, troublesome, expendable. Enki, by contrast, saw potential, a creation worth nurturing. Between these two currents, humanity grew, caught in the tension between punishment and progress. The myths do not shy away from this contradiction. They tell of gods who punished mankind with plagues, with famine, with flood, yet also of gods who guided, protected, and preserved them. Humanity was fragile, vulnerable, and yet chosen, again and again, for survival. It is as though the fate of mankind mattered to these beings in ways we cannot fully understand. Why would gods care so deeply about human destiny? If they were truly divine, beyond time and space, why would our survival matter at all? But if they were beings of flesh and blood, invested in a project of creation, then our survival was essential, for we were their work, their legacy, perhaps even their purpose. To look at these myths through modern eyes is to see shadows of science disguised as story. The clay, the blood, the breath. These may be metaphors for processes too complex to describe with the language of the time. Genetic engineering, hybridization, artificial intervention, all concepts foreign to the ancient mind, yet perhaps dimly remembered in myth. The gods, as creators, may not have been mystical beings, but advanced entities wielding knowledge that, to early humans, was indistinguishable from magic. And still, the mystery deepens. If mankind was created, then what of our freedom? Are we children of the stars, designed with intention, or are we simply laborers fashioned to serve a higher power? The myths hint at both, leaving us in the tension of paradox. They raise a haunting possibility that humanity's story is not of accidental evolution, but of intervention, manipulation, and purpose. We are not merely of the earth, we are also of the heavens, shaped by those who came down, molded as clay in their hands. In the silence of ruins, in the broken tablets that whisper across thousands of years, this story endures. It is a story of origin, but also of mystery, a story that suggests we are not entirely what we think we are. We may carry within us the fingerprints of another world, the legacy of beings whose reasons remain unknown. Were we created as servants, as students, as experiments, or as something beyond all of these? The Sumerians left us only fragments, enough to stir awe, enough to awaken questions that refuse to fade. Perhaps this is the greatest gift of the myth of creation. Not an answer, but a riddle, a reminder that our beginnings may hold secrets stranger than any we dare imagine, that within the clay from which we were formed lies a spark, not of earth, but of stars. Among the most haunting tales, in the Sumerian tablets, lies a story that reverberates through time, echoing in cultures far beyond Mesopotamia. It is the tale of the flood, a cataclysm so vast that it reshaped not only the land, but the very memory of humanity. For the Sumerians, this was not merely a story of waters rising, but of gods divided, of mankind nearly erased, and of a single act of defiance that preserved the fragile flame of life. To later ages, it would be retold in new words, transformed into the biblical account of Noah's Ark. Yet at its heart, the ancient story whispers a disturbing possibility, that the flood was not a natural disaster at all, but a deliberate act of annihilation, orchestrated by powers beyond human comprehension. The Atrahasis epic tells us that humanity, created to labor for the gods, had grown too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. Their cries filled the earth and disturbed Enlil, the lord of the air, whose patience for humankind had long since waned. Enlil, unlike Enki, did not see humanity as a species to be nurtured, but as a nuisance to be silenced. And so he conceived a plan not of correction, but of extermination. A flood, vast and unrelenting, would wash across the land, sweeping away men and women, children and elders, fields and cities. It would erase humanity from existence, restoring quiet to the earth and sparing the gods the clamor of mortals. The decision was not shared with mankind. It was decreed in the assembly of the gods, hidden from those who were to perish. Yet among the divine, not all were in agreement. Enki, the benefactor, the wise, looked upon humanity with different eyes. He remembered their labor, their fragility, their struggles. He remembered that it was he who had helped shape them, he who had breathed life into clay. To destroy them utterly was not only cruel but senseless. If mankind was flawed, they could be guided. If mankind was noisy, they could be taught. To wipe them away was to erase the work of ages, to undo a creation that had already taken root upon the earth. Enki could not defy Enlil openly. Such defiance would fracture the order of the gods themselves. Yet he found another way. The epic tells us that Enki whispered warnings, not directly, but through subtle means, speaking to reeds, speaking to walls, knowing that Atrahasis, the chosen mortal, would hear. He instructed Atrahasis to build a vessel vast enough to hold his family, his animals, and the seeds of life. He gave him the dimensions, the design, the knowledge needed to endure the coming deluge. And when the flood came, when waters covered the land and the storm raged for days and nights beyond counting, Atrahasis survived. Humanity did not vanish. It was preserved, carried upon the waves in a vessel crafted from divine instruction. This story does not stand alone. In later Babylonian tradition, it becomes the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim recounts the flood to the wandering king. And in Hebrew scripture, it becomes the tale of Noah, chosen by God to build an ark, to preserve life against a flood sent to cleanse the world. The parallels are unmistakable. A deity or deities deciding upon destruction, a chosen man warned, a vessel constructed, life preserved, and a covenant established after the waters recede. The pattern is too precise to be coincidence. These are not separate myths, but echoes of a shared memory, carried across cultures, reshaped by language, but rooted in the same primordial event. Yet within the Sumerian account lies a darker implication. The flood was not a punishment from nature, not an accident of weather or shifting rivers. It was a decision, deliberate and calculated. The gods unleashed it not because they could not control the world, but because they sought to control humanity. This shifts the story from tragedy to something more chilling, a genocide written not in the hands of fate, but in the council of the divine. If the Anunnaki were not gods but advanced beings, then the flood becomes not a myth, but a form of ancient population control, an orchestrated reset of humanity itself. Was it truly water that brought destruction? The tablets speak of storms, of winds that roared like lions, of darkness covering the earth. To the ancients, such descriptions conveyed terror beyond comprehension. To modern ears, they sound eerily like cataclysmic events, perhaps natural, perhaps not. A flood could be caused by shifting seas, by melting ice, by planetary upheaval, but it could also be induced. Dams broken, waters redirected, skies unleashed. If the Anunnaki wielded technology indistinguishable from divine power, then weather itself may have been their weapon. Consider too the precision of the survival plan. Atrahasis is not saved by luck. He is not the only survivor by chance. He is instructed, given blueprints, given foreknowledge. This suggests that the flood was not a total annihilation, but a controlled event designed to erase the many while preserving the chosen few. Was humanity culled, reduced, reshaped according to the will of the gods? If so, then the flood was less about destruction and more about control, about remaking civilization to suit the needs of those who governed it. When the waters receded, the myths tell us that the gods were filled with regret. They gathered around the sacrifice offered by Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, drawn by the smell, lamenting the loss of humankind. Even Enlil, fierce in his wrath, softened, agreeing never again to unleash such devastation. But regret does not erase intent. The flood had already rewritten history. Entire generations were gone, cities erased, stories lost. Humanity's survival rested on the thin thread of one man's obedience to whispered warnings. And so, the flood stands as both destruction and beginning. It marks the end of an old order and the start of a new one. It is rebirth, but also scar. Its memory endures because it was more than story. It was trauma, etched into collective memory, carried into every culture that descended from Mesopotamia. And perhaps it endures because it was not only real but orchestrated, a deliberate scar inflicted upon the human race by those who held power over its destiny. If this is true, then the flood is not just myth, nor even history. It is evidence. Evidence that humanity's survival has always been precarious, shaped by forces we barely understand. Evidence that the beings we called gods held in their hands the power to erase us and chose more than once to exercise it. Evidence that our greatest catastrophes may not have been accidents of nature, but deliberate resets, moments when the project of humanity was judged, pruned, and preserved according to plans hidden from us. The story of the flood is not only about waters rising, it is about control, about survival, about the terrifying possibility that our fate has never been entirely our own. And as we look back at the tablets, at the echoes in scripture, at the myths repeated across continents, we must ask, was the flood a memory of nature's fury, or a warning carved in clay, telling us that the powers who shaped us have always been capable of wiping us away? In the cradle of Mesopotamia, where rivers wove life into desert sands, the story of civilization unfolded with a suddenness that continues to puzzle historians. One moment, humanity was scattered in small tribes, living off the land in fragile balance. Then, almost overnight in the scale of history, there appeared cities, agriculture, writing, astronomy, mathematics, and the structure of kingship itself. To the Sumerians, this was not a slow discovery born of chance. It was a gift, or perhaps a decree, delivered by those they called the Anunnaki. The tablets tell us that after the creation of humankind, the gods bestowed upon them the tools of survival and the keys to prosperity. Agriculture was the first and most vital. Enki, the god of wisdom, was said to have organized the distribution of waters, teaching irrigation, guiding the flow of rivers into fertile fields. Without these techniques, the land would have remained barren. With them, it became a garden of abundance, capable of feeding not only villages but great cities. The Sumerians credited these skills not to human ingenuity but to divine instruction. In their eyes, the gods had taught them how to bend nature itself to human need. Astronomy followed. The skies became more than mystery. They became a map. The Sumerians tracked the movements of stars and planets with astonishing precision, charting cycles that still guide us today. Their understanding of celestial order was uncanny, too advanced for a culture so newly born. They divided the heavens into constellations, recorded eclipses, and set calendars that aligned with cosmic rhythms. To them, this knowledge was not invention but revelation, granted by beings who walked among them and looked to the stars not as distant lights, but as familiar realms. Then came kingship, the crown of civilization. The Sumerians believed kingship descended from heaven. The ruler was not simply a man chosen by his people, but a figure sanctioned by the gods, endowed with authority to govern on their behalf. Ziggurats rose as stairways between earth and heaven, monuments where priests and kings mediated between humanity and the divine. The very structure of society, its laws, its hierarchies, its rituals, was said to flow from the Anunnaki. Humanity was no longer a collection of wanderers, but an organized, obedient civilization. To the Sumerians, these gifts were acts of benevolence. What could be greater than the gods teaching them to sow grain, to read the skies, to govern their lands? But hidden beneath the gratitude lies a darker question. Were these truly gifts, or were they chains? Agriculture bound people to land, to toil endlessly in fields that fed not only themselves, but also the temples of the gods. Astronomy did not merely open the skies. It allowed priests to regulate time, to control rituals, to dictate when to sow, when to harvest, when to worship. Kingship, framed as a divine blessing, ensured obedience not only to rulers, but to the unseen powers who had supposedly placed them on thrones. In this light, civilization appears not as liberation, but as control. The Anunnaki did not simply give knowledge. They embedded humanity into systems that served them. Cities grew not just for human benefit, but for the glory of temples dedicated to the gods, where offerings flowed in unending streams. Kings did not rule independently. They were intermediaries, their authority borrowed from the divine. The Sumerians believed themselves elevated, yet they were also bound, subjects of a structure, designed by powers greater than themselves. Consider the ziggurats, those massive stepped temples that dominated the skyline of Sumerian cities. They were not mere monuments. Each was a cosmic bridge, a link between heaven and earth. At their summit were chambers said to host the presence of gods who descended from the skies. Were these simply houses of worship, or were they platforms, landing places for beings who traveled through the heavens? If so, then kingship was not only symbolic, it was direct governance where chosen rulers acted as the earthly hands of extraterrestrial masters. The tablets themselves hint at this dual nature of civilization. Enki is portrayed as a teacher, guiding humanity with care, but Enlil is stern, demanding obedience quick to punish. Together they embody attention, uplift and control, benevolence and dominance. The Anunnaki may have given tools, but they also dictated their use. They gave laws, but those laws ensured loyalty. They bestowed kingship, but the throne was never fully human. It was always tethered to the divine. This raises a troubling question. Did humanity truly leap forward on its own, or were we accelerated, pushed along a path designed by others? If agriculture, astronomy, and kingship were not human inventions but external impositions, then civilization itself may not have been our destiny, but our assignment. We were not only taught, we were programmed. To modernize, the sudden rise of Sumer remains mysterious. How could a people so recently formed develop such advanced systems? How could they map the skies with such precision, regulate society with such sophistication, build monumental architecture with such coordination? Scholars call it the Sumerian miracle, but miracles may have explanations hidden in the clay tablets that speak of gods who descended from the heavens. If those gods were flesh and blood, their gifts may have been nothing more than technology passed down to a species too young to question its purpose. And yet not all was oppressive. The Sumerians celebrated their gods with hymns of gratitude, with songs of joy. They saw beauty in the order that had been given, prosperity in the fields that now yielded grain. To them, life was richer under the guidance of the Anunnaki. Perhaps this was true. Perhaps, compared to the harsh uncertainty of a world without structure, the ordered life of civilization seemed like a paradise. But beneath the surface, one must wonder, was this paradise chosen or imposed? The image of humanity as subjects, organized beneath the watchful eyes of higher powers, lingers like a shadow over the story of Sumer. Were we uplifted, or were we domesticated, much like animals brought from wildness into pens, fed, cared for, yet always under the hand of the master? Civilization, in this sense, becomes not a triumph, but a cage. Its walls are made of laws, its bars are kingship, its guards are priests, all pointing back to the Anunnaki who designed it. Still, the question remains unresolved. Were the Anunnaki benevolent teachers who gave humanity the chance to flourish, or rulers who shaped us into obedient servants of their will? The truth may lie somewhere in between, a paradox that cannot be escaped. Humanity was elevated, but also bound. We were given the keys to knowledge, but also the chains of obedience. Civilization itself may be both the greatest gift and the most subtle form of control. And so the story of agriculture, astronomy, and kingship is not only about progress, it is about power. It is about how knowledge can liberate or enslave, depending on the hands that hold it. In the myths of Sumer, we glimpse both sides of this coin, and we are left to ask, when the gods descended to teach us, were they raising us toward the stars, or binding us more tightly to the earth beneath their feet? Conflict was not foreign to the Sumerian gods. For all their power, their hierarchy, and their wisdom, the Anunnaki were never portrayed as a harmonious pantheon. They quarreled, they schemed, they waged battles against one another. Far from being eternal embodiments of pure divinity, they were figures of rivalry, ambition, and pride. And in these ancient conflicts, whispered through tablets and hymns, lies a tantalizing suggestion that what the Sumerians called wars in the heavens may not have been myths at all, but the distorted memory of real struggles fought with powers humanity could not comprehend. The rivalry between Enki and Enlil is only the beginning. Enlil, strict and severe, believed in control through order and punishment. Enki, wise and cunning, saw value in guiding rather than destroying. Their opposition created tension not only in the heavens, but in the lives of humans who became pawns in their cosmic disagreements. When Enlil demanded humanity's destruction through the flood, Enki defied him by secretly ensuring survival. This was not merely a clash of ideology, it was war by other means. one waged through the fate of mankind. But the myths also speak of greater conflicts, battles that shook both heaven and earth. In one tale, Ninurta, son of Enlil, takes up arms against a monstrous foe, wielding weapons described in language that blurs the line between myth and machinery. The texts describe roaring storms, blazing fire, and floods unleashed in combat. To the Sumerians, these were divine powers. To modern eyes, they bear uncanny resemblance to technologies of destruction, explosions, projectiles, forces that could lay waste to cities. In other accounts, the Anunnaki themselves divide into factions, their loyalties split, their battles echoing the rivalries of earthly kings. The skies are said to thunder with their wrath, the land to tremble beneath their conflict. Such imagery begs the question, were these merely poetic visions of storms, or were they accounts of actual battles fought with weapons beyond human understanding? Imagine ancient witnesses seeing lights streak across the heavens, hearing deafening blasts, watching fire consume the horizon. Lacking the language of science, they could only describe such events as the wars of gods. The Epic of Error, though later Babylonian, offers glimpses into this idea. Error, a destructive deity, is armed with terrifying weapons that scorch the land. The text describes chaos, devastation, and a kind of radiance that leaves cities lifeless. Some have drawn parallels between these accounts and the imagery of nuclear destruction, firestorms, winds, and invisible forces that linger long after the initial strike. Could the myths of divine warfare be echoes of catastrophic technologies unleashed in ancient times? Sumerian cosmology even describes a war in the heavens themselves. The Anunnaki, descending from the skies, were not united. Some sought dominion, others defied them. Their battles were reflected in constellations, in stories of celestial strife, as though the stars themselves were theaters of conflict. These tales might seem fantastical, yet when read through the lens of possible extraterrestrial contact, they take on another dimension. Were the Sumerians recording cosmic battles witnessed from afar, wars between starfaring factions whose struggles spilled over onto Earth? The imagery of storms is particularly revealing. Enlil, master of winds, is often described unleashing tempests that scatter armies and level cities. To the ancients, these were supernatural storms. But what if they were weapons, sonic blasts, energy discharges, or technologies that manipulated weather itself? Fire from the heavens, floods unleashed, winds that destroyed. Each could be a metaphor, an attempt to describe forces so advanced they appeared divine. One cannot ignore the destruction described in tales of divine wrath. Entire cities, once vibrant, are said to have been turned to dust by the gods' anger. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, though preserved in Hebrew tradition, bears striking similarities. Fire rains from the skies, the ground shakes, and a city is reduced to ash. Is this coincidence or the echo of a single event retold across cultures, a memory of catastrophic warfare unleashed by beings with power far beyond human means? The wars among the gods also mirror human politics. Just as earthly kings clashed for land, power, and loyalty, so too did the Anunnaki fight among themselves. Their rivalries often determined which cities thrived and which fell. A city favored by Enlil might flourish. One favored by Enki could face suspicion and destruction. Human destiny was bound to these divine conflicts, as though mankind were chess pieces on a board far larger than they could see. To the Sumerians, this was divine fate. To us, it raises another possibility, that humanity lived under the shadow of a greater empire, its rulers divided, its battles spilling into our world. Consider the possibility of fire chariots, often described in Mesopotamian and later traditions. Vehicles that roared, that blazed, that ascended into the skies. Were these simply poetic visions of the sun, or did they represent actual craft, piloted by beings who fought their wars not only in the heavens, but upon the earth? If so, then the myths are not allegories, but records preserving in symbolic form the memory of technologies long forgotten. And then there is the imagery of the terrifying brilliance associated with divine weaponry. Tablets describe radiance so fierce that mortals could not look upon it, energies that withered fields, winds that carried death. Such descriptions align uncannily with radiation, with the aftermath of weapons that scorch not only flesh, but the very earth. Could it be that the so-called wars of the gods were Ancient conflicts fought with weapons resembling those humanity would not rediscover until the modern age. If true, then our technological progress may not be invention at all, but rediscovery of tools once wielded on this planet by others. What emerges from these myths is not a picture of serene divinity but of turmoil, rivalry, and destruction. The Anunnaki were not aloof, distant beings. They were active, contentious, and dangerous. They walked among humans, ruled them, taught them, but also dragged them into conflicts that scarred the land and shaped history. Civilization itself may have risen not in peace, but in the aftermath of cosmic battles fought above and around it. For the Sumerians, these tales explained why cities rose and fell, why rulers triumphed or failed, why the heavens rumbled and the earth shook. For us, they offer something more unsettling. If the myths are memories, then humanity has long lived under the shadow of powers whose conflicts could erase us in an instant. Fire from the skies, storms unleashed, destruction that reshaped the world. These are not only myths, they may be warnings, fragments of truth carved into clay, reminding us that the gods we once worshipped were not beyond conflict, and that their wars may have been fought not only for their dominion, but at the cost of our world. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fade into dust, yet their stories endure. The Sumerians, the world's first great architects of knowledge, did not vanish into silence when their cities fell. Their myths, their sciences, their very conception of gods who ruled from the heavens flowed outward, absorbed by later peoples who carried the torch of Mesopotamian wisdom. In Babylon and Assyria, the names of deities shifted, their temples grew higher, their empires more vast, but beneath the surface, the fingerprints of Sumer remained, whispering of the Anunnaki long after Sumer itself was gone. Babylon is perhaps the clearest heir to this legacy. Rising centuries after the decline of Sumer, Babylon inherited the cuneiform script, the calendar, and the cosmology of its predecessors. The god Marduk, who would become the central figure of Babylonian religion, was in many ways an echo of older Sumerian deities. His struggles, his ascension, his wars in the heavens, these mirror earlier tales of Enlil and Ninurta, reimagined for a new empire. But the underlying structure is unmistakable. Battles among gods, the descent of kingship from the heavens, and the shaping of humanity by divine rulers. Even as the names changed, the themes remained, like fragments of a memory too powerful to be erased. Assyria carried the legacy further. Fierce and militaristic, the Assyrians glorified their kings as chosen by the gods, just as the Sumerians had. Their temples bore inscriptions that spoke of divine weapons, radiant forces, and rulers acting as intermediaries between heaven and earth. The imagery of winged beings carved in stone, the Apkallu, guardians of wisdom, was a continuation of Sumerian motifs. To them, knowledge came from those who descended long ago, and kingship was sanctified by powers beyond this world. As centuries passed, the myths spread beyond Mesopotamia. In Canaan, Egypt, and later in Greece, echoes of the Anunnaki appear under new guises. The biblical Nephilim, giants born of the sons of God and the daughters of men, bear uncanny resemblance to tales of divine beings mingling with humanity. The flood narrative, nearly identical to the Sumerian account of Enlil and Enki, survives in Genesis, its divine conflict reframed but unmistakable in origin. Were these mere borrowings of story, or were they records of a shared memory? One civilization after another, inheriting fragments of an encounter humanity could not fully comprehend. The persistence of these motifs suggests more than coincidence. Fire from the heavens, gods descending, humanity shaped and ruled, floods that cleansed the world. These stories traveled across cultures and ages, surviving in altered forms. If they were inventions, why did so many different peoples preserve the same images, the same patterns, as though compelled to remember? Perhaps the myths were not inventions at all, but interpretations of a truth too vast, too alien, to be expressed plainly. Archaeology reveals more clues. The Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians all left behind astonishing records of astronomical knowledge. They charted the paths of Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn with precision, long before telescopes existed. They recorded cycles of eclipses, solstices, and lunar phases with mathematical accuracy. Some texts even describe the existence of planets beyond those visible to the naked eye. Scholars argue over whether these were guesses or calculations. Yet the Sumerians themselves were clear. Their knowledge came from the gods who taught them. Were these gods astronomers from another world, passing down knowledge of the stars they once traversed? Even the concept of time itself, the 60-minute hour, the 12-month year, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, was a Sumerian inheritance. Such systems did not evolve randomly. They were structured, deliberate, as if imposed from above. Every civilization that followed, knowingly or not, lived within the framework designed in Sumer. Could it be that humanity was not only taught how to farm and rule, but also how to measure the very fabric of time and space? If so, then our daily lives still carry the shadow of the Anunnaki. The myths also endured in art and ritual. The winged figures etched into Assyrian palaces, holding strange devices, are strikingly reminiscent of beings not of Earth. Some appear to carry objects resembling pine cones and wristwatches, symbols whose meanings remain elusive. To the ancients, they were sacred images. To modern eyes, they hint at technology, portable tools, instruments, perhaps even devices of communication. Could these carvings be visual records of the Anunnaki themselves, preserved in stone so their memory could not be lost? As Babylon fell, as Assyria crumbled, the myths scattered further, embedding themselves in the roots of Western and Eastern traditions alike. Greek tales of gods who descended from Olympus to rule and seduce mortals carry the same themes. Egyptian myths of Ra and Osiris speak of rulers who came from the heavens, granting order and knowledge. Even in distant lands, echoes can be heard. The Maya and the Inca spoke of gods who taught them astronomy and agriculture, who came from the skies and returned there. How is it that so many cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, preserved the same idea, that humanity was guided, perhaps even governed, by beings from beyond? Skeptics argue that myths spread through cultural contact, that the flood of Sumer became the flood of Babylon, and then the flood of Genesis. But this explanation cannot erase the deeper question: why did the story take such powerful root in the first place? Why did the image of divine beings descending endure across thousands of years, reshaping itself again and again? Myths fade, evolve, or vanish, yet the core of the Anunnaki narrative, gods from the heavens, teaching, ruling, warring, refuses to die. Perhaps the myths persisted because they were not merely stories but memories. Humanity may have preserved them instinctively, not as entertainment but as fragments of history, like a dream half remembered, passed down from one generation to the next, reshaped with each telling, yet always carrying the same kernel of truth. We were visited, we were taught, and we were ruled by those who came from elsewhere. Even today, the legacy of the Anunnaki resonates. Archaeologists uncover tablets that still baffle with their detail. Historians marvel at the sudden rise of Sumer, still calling it a miracle. Writers and seekers continue to explore the mysteries of gods who may not have been gods at all. And through it all, the question lingers: was it merely myth, or is there a hidden history beneath the dust of ages? The persistence of the story across time demands an answer. Either the Anunnaki were the most enduring creation of the human imagination, or they were real, beings who once walked this earth, whose presence was so profound that no culture could fully forget. Which possibility is more astonishing? That so many civilizations imagined the same impossible tale, or that they all preserved in their own ways the memory of an encounter humanity has yet to fully understand? And so the legacy of Sumer lives on, not only in the ruins of ziggurats or the fragments of cuneiform tablets, but in the stories we still tell, the myths that shape our religions, and the systems that govern our world. Perhaps we are all still living under the shadow of the first teachers, the first rulers, the first beings who claimed the earth as their domain. Perhaps their story never ended at all. The story of the Anunnaki does not end with the fall of Sumer, nor with the rise and fall of Babylon and Assyria. It lingers like a shadow cast across millennia, reaching even into our own time. Clay tablets may crumble, ziggurats may sink into the dust, but the memory of gods, or visitors, who came from the heavens, refuses to die. And as we stand in the modern age with our telescopes pointed skyward and our machines reaching into the void, the question grows louder: who were they really? To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were divine, beings whose authority was unquestionable. They granted kingship, taught agriculture, dictated laws, and decided the fate of humanity itself. They were as real to the people of Mesopotamia as the rivers that sustained their land. Yet their portrayal is strikingly different from later, ethereal gods worshipped in other cultures. The Anunnaki were tangible. They walked in cities, spoke to rulers, feasted, quarreled, and waged wars. They were not distant spirits, but presences among men. This simple fact forces us to confront a chilling possibility. What if the Sumerians were describing not imagination, but experience? Myth, after all, is often the language of memory. It wraps truth in symbols, clothing events too overwhelming to grasp in the high fabric of story. When the Sumerians wrote of gods descending from the heavens, were they cloaking cosmic visitors in mythic attire? When they spoke of humans shaped from clay, were they describing not a miracle, but a manipulation of flesh and blood, life engineered by hands not our own? And when they etched tales of floods, wars, and radiant weapons, were they leaving us warnings of events too catastrophic to be forgotten? Some would argue that to see aliens in the Anunnaki is to stretch imagination too far. Yet consider this: how did civilization rise so suddenly, almost overnight, in Sumer? How did writing, astronomy, law, mathematics, and monumental architecture appear in one land with no slow path of trial and error, but with the force of sudden revelation? The Sumerians themselves never claimed credit. They were clear. Their knowledge came from those who descended. To dismiss their words entirely is to ignore the voices of the very people who lived through it. If the Anunnaki were real, if they walked this earth, what was their purpose? Some say they came as teachers, guiding humanity to rise from the mud into the light of civilization. Others whisper darker possibilities, that we were not taught but harnessed, that humanity was engineered as workers, shaped for labor, ruled as subjects in a kingdom not our own. To them, our history is not a story of human triumph, but of bondage under masters whose shadows still loom unseen. Yet even in these myths there is hope. Enki, the benefactor of mankind, stood against Enlil's wrath. He saved humanity when destruction loomed. He whispered knowledge and compassion. This duality, some gods seeking control, others seeking to uplift, mirrors the complexity of the human condition itself. Perhaps our creators, if they were indeed from beyond, were divided in their vision for us. Perhaps we are the product of a cosmic struggle, caught between tyranny and liberation. The legacy of the Anunnaki did not vanish with their departure, if they ever truly left. Their symbols, their stories, their knowledge still pulse through our world. Every time we look at the division of hours, every time we trace constellations across the night sky, every time we read a text born of the written word, we are living within the framework first shaped in ancient Mesopotamia. The gods may be gone, but their fingerprints remain. And then comes the most haunting question of, all? If they came once, could they come again? Myths often describe their departure not as an ending, but as a withdrawal. They ascended, they returned to the heavens, promising or implying that their presence was not forever severed. Some traditions even whisper of their return, of a cycle in which the gods walk among men once more. What would such a return mean for humanity today? We have reached a point where the line between myth and possibility grows thin. Humanity now sends probes across the solar system, listens for signals from the stars, and dreams of colonizing other worlds. We stand at the threshold of becoming the very kind of beings our ancestors once described: masters of technology, traversers of heavens, wielders of forces once called divine. Could it be that in seeking the stars, we are not venturing into the unknown, but retracing the steps of those who once walked among us? Perhaps the Anunnaki were not gods, not aliens, not rulers, but something else entirely. Beings from another time, another dimension, or another branch of existence that brushes against ours. Perhaps they were guardians, or perhaps conquerors. Perhaps they left deliberately, leaving humanity to grow, or perhaps they wait, watching for a moment when they will return to reclaim what they began. The ruins of Mesopotamia whisper, but do not answer. The tablets hint, but never explain. And so the mystery endures, tantalizing, unbroken. Were the Anunnaki myth or memory? Were they beings of imagination or of flesh and bone and starlight? Did they shape us for their purposes or for our own destiny? As the night sky stretches above us, the same sky once watched by Sumerian priests on their ziggurats, the same stars that inspired stories of gods descending, one question remains: are we alone? Or are we living in the echo of an ancient truth that we are not the first nor the only to walk this earth with the gift of knowledge? And if the Anunnaki once walked among us, if they shaped our world and our destiny, then the final, most haunting question must be asked: will they walk among us again?